This entry is maybe a little bit different than what I might usually do, in that it's not so much a rambling or an musing about an old memory or something that I like to think about, but it's rather someone else's story. And it was inspired because of my neighbor who talks a lot about her cats, and I just love the way she talks about them. It's very much like she recognizes their personalities, and I love her accent, which I will attempt to replicate a little bit here. And of course I had to tell it because the cats wanted me to also. So without further ado, and you may hear some crickets in the background and bullfrogs, but that's kind of appropriate to the story too. So, again, without further ado, the Cats of Bear Mountain. Tiny was having a purely awful day. It all started when that dumb old boy cat Fatty had the nerve to get on Mama's bed and get close to Tiny's birthday blanket while she was sunning on it. Now, anybody who had a bit of sense knew you weren't supposed to touch Tiny's birthday blanket, except when Mama washed it for her and made it clean and fluffy. Tiny dearly loved her birthday blanket. It was soft as could be, even the color, gold and pink, like the mist on the mountaintop when the sun set. And Mama always folded it just so and put it on the corner of the bed. Well, let me tell you, Tiny raised her little paw to that Fatty and hissed with all her might. Of course, he didn't even have the sense to care, just stared at her and walked on by. Sometimes Tiny thought he must not even realize she was the boss around here. Mama saw what happened and let Fatty out the door laughing. She said, "All right now, y'all, you're family. Be sweet." Tiny thought about going on out there to give him more what for, but she stuck her pretty white paw out just a little and, it was awful cold. So she backed right up. She thought it might be warmer out the front door and asked Mama to open it, but nope, no warmer there either. So Mama put a new layer of food on top of the old, and Tiny had her breakfast. She was hoping Mama might do her hair later. She loved to look her best. Her hair was so sleek and silky, though. It was mighty pretty, brushed or not. Tiny went to sunning on her birthday blanket and saw that wild boy Precious prowling around outside the window. Precious thought he was the ruler of the place, just because he could run so fast and climb so high. He'd get all dirty hunting bugs and other nasty things out in the woodshed. Made Tiny shiver just to think of it. And he thought he was all high and mighty when Papa let him ride on the red wheelbarrow, bringing him wood down for the stove. Why, that Precious couldn't even be bothered to have a proper tail. It was so big and thick, like some raccoon or mountain cat. He said he could flick off flies better that way. Of course, he always had to lord it over Tiny, how Papa used to button him up all snug in his shirt when Precious was a baby, and they'd sit swinging on the back porch swing together. Precious said he was Papa's special one. Well, that just aggravated Tiny to no end. Everybody knew anything about Tiny knew that she was the prettiest, with her shiny black fur and little white bib. And that had to mean she was the most special. What kind of name was Precious for a boy, anyway? Tiny didn't know how she ended up with the world's two worst brothers when she was so good. Well, she knew how they ended up there, just not why she had to put up with it. Fatty used to live with a real old lady in a little bitty house with 2 rooms, and he just laid on the windowsill all day and watched cars. At least that's what Mama told her. Fatty wasn't around cats at all growing up, so he didn't talk much. Mama said the lady went to live with family who didn't like cats. What kind of folk are that? So Mama took Fatty in and started to try to tame his wild black hair and help him be nice. And Precious just showed up one day as a little bitty kitten, and Papa took a liking to her. Now, Tiny herself was found outside Mama's church. Tiny figured the angels left her for Mama and Papa. Mama was making sweet potatoes on the stove today. Those were Tiny's favorites. They made the whole house smell so good. Mama told her they were sweet just like her. Tyler the bird likes spaghetti best. Tiny thought they looked like worms, and she'd seen the birds out in the yard yanking worms out of the dirt, so she figured that was why Tyler liked spaghetti. Tyler had a lot to say about everything, especially food. Of course, Precious was too good to eat any food inside. He said he caught his own food. And of course, Fatty liked just about everything. About midday, Tiny decided to have Mama open the door for her again. The mist had burned off when the sun got up high, and it had warmed up right nice. Tiny surely did like all the colors the mist made, the mountains. She thought that Crayola place that made the crayons Mama's grandbaby played with ought to make a whole box called Carolina Mountain Blues. And when it started lifting up off the mountain, it turned all white and fluffy, like the clouds came down and sat right on top of the mountain. But oh my, could that mist be cold. But this afternoon the sky was a different kind of blue, like the bluebirds in summer, and the white clouds were way up high. And it was just warm enough for Tiny to go out a bit. Of course, no sooner did she step out than that there tomboy Precious was jumping at her. "Come on, Tiny, race me to that tree over yonder. I'll even give you a head start." "You just go on, Precious Fleming." That's what Mama called him at night when she wanted him to come home. "I got better things to do than just run around like crazy," said Tiny. "Oh, yeah? Like what? Go admire yourself looking in the pond?" laughed Precious. "You're just jealous you don't have my pretty blue eyes." Tiny just hissed a little at that and stalked on off. The nerve of that cat. Why, she just looked in the pond from time to time to make sure her fur was nice and in place, not because she was vain or nothing. Tiny strode along at a dignified pace like a lady, sniffing the grass a little and watching the birds. "I can catch those birds," said Precious. "Oh, go away, you braggart. I don't want no feathers in my mouth anyway." So Precious zoomed off on his next adventure, first racing up the tree and jumping down just to show off. Tiny sat and cleaned her paws a little in the sun. You could never have your nice white mittens too clean. And she saw Fatty napping under his favorite big old bush. It had flowers like little suns. He blended right in with the shadow underneath so you could hardly see him. His fur was so pretty and black, just like the night sky, except it didn't sparkle like all the millions of stars Tiny loved so much. Tiny wished she had one of those stars to wear around her neck. Tiny always told Fatty he ought to take care of that pretty hair. But Fatty didn't pay her no mind. He said it didn't make no sense to go fixing yourself up just to lay in the red clay under his bush. Fatty spent most of his time under that bush in summer, or under Tyler's cage by the wood stove in winter. As Tiny was moving on to grooming her tail, she saw Papa coming up the drive on his big red tractor. And of all things, that high and mighty Precious Fleming was sitting up there big as you can please right by him. Oh, that made Tiny's tail go to thumping on the ground. Precious thought Papa belonged to him. That's why Mama always called him Precious Fleming, after Papa's folks. She said Precious was just a little stubborn, like the Flemings. Mama always smiled when she said little. When Papa stopped, Precious came by and, of course, had to be so proud of himself. "You see me and Papa, Tiny? Sure is fun way up high there. You ought to come sometime, scaredy cat." "You miss out on all the fun, Tiny. All you care about is looking all pretty and laying on your birthday blanket. Papa and me been busy today. We cut wood and I rode on the wheelbarrow and we went fishing." Well, that just aggravated Tiny to no end, and she flounced back inside. Precious ran around the yard a few times laughing. He sure did like to aggravate that prissy old Tiny. Fatty just watched the two of them from under his bush and thought he had better things to do, like nap. When Tiny got back in, she saw Papa had dropped his jacket on the stool, and it smelled so nice and fresh from the wood he'd been cutting. She curled up on it so she'd smell good, too. Mama always liked to sniff Papa when he smelled of wood. And she took her own nap. Tiny woke up later, and Mama and Papa were getting ready to go to church. Mama told Papa to get Precious and put him in his outdoor cage. Precious was too wild to sleep inside, so Papa had made him a big, strong, safe cage to sleep in at night, with a nice warm bed inside of it. But Papa came in later and said he couldn't find him anywhere, so they went on off and him outside. Just like that, Precious thought Tiny, never doing what he was supposed to. Fatty decided he'd stay out too, since it was still nice and warm, and he had plenty of napping left to do under his bush. Well, Tiny was just fine with having the house all to herself. She'd just watch Mama's new wind chimes dance in the breeze and look at the birds hopping around and have her little dinner before she got on her birthday blanket. But next thing she knew, Tyler was carrying on something awful, ringing his bell and squawking at the top of his lungs. "Tyler, what's got into you? Hush up that awful noise." But Tyler just kept a-hollering. So Tiny went to see what in the world was going on. Well, let me tell you, her eyes just about bugged right out of her head when she looked out the window and saw what was there. A bear had Precious up the tree. She was way on up there where Tiny couldn't even hardly see her. And now it looked like that old bear was going to come on up after her. Tiny was beside herself. She jumped down off the windowsill and ran all around the house in a panic. Then she thought, "I gotta do something. I gotta save my brother. Somebody help me." She prayed for an angel to come. But then a vision came right into Tiny's head. She saw the day an old hound dog had come up in the yard and was sniffing all around the bushes till he found Fatty there. And Fatty got on up and stretched and stood up all big and strong and arched his back and stared right at that old hound dog. And buddy, let me tell you, that dog went to running and squealing like a swarm of yellow jackets was after him. Tiny thought, if Fatty scared that old hound so bad just standing up, he sure ought to be able to scare that bear. So Tiny ran to the window above where Fatty's bush was and started pounding on it. Bang, bang, went her determined white paws on the glass. She saw Fatty's great big head come poking out. "Fatty, Fatty," Tiny called. "Go on round the house to the other side. Precious done got himself just up a tree by a bear, and he's coming on up after him. You gotta go chase him off." Well, Fatty didn't even hesitate. He got right on up and ran like the dickens around the house and straight at that bear, hissing and spitting and yowling like that day Mama stepped backwards onto his tail. He never even stopped, and Tiny wasn't sure if she was seeing things, but it seemed like he glowed, just like a real angel, as he headed straight at that bear. The bear took one look, and just like that old hound, he up and took to running. Fatty ran on after him till he was long gone. Precious came on down out of the tree. "Fatty, thank y'all so much. You saved my life. How'd you know to come running?" "Tiny told me. She woke me up and yelled at me to help you." Well, that just shocked Precious down to his toes. Now he'd have to say thank you to Tiny, and Tiny already thought she was Queen Bee. Mama and Papa drove up just then, never even knowing what went on. Precious followed them on inside to find Tiny. Tiny, you and Fatty saved my life. I always thought you wanted me gone like I was a flea or something. And Tiny said, Precious Fleming, y'all might make me madder than a wet hen sometimes, but you're my brother. And they touched noses, which made Mama almost faint. Fatty watched and waved his big old plume of a tail, then went to lay near the wood stove, and Tiny went to her birthday blanket and said to Precious, Maybe just this once you'd like to lay on down here too. And they all got to what was most important, napping. I'll see y'all next time.